Most people don't realize it, but there is a quiet, almost invisible pattern influencing many modern relationships. It appears in small moments, when you soften your no, when you rush to justify how you feel, or when you explain your decisions as if they require approval to be valid. On the surface, it seems harmless, even polite, but if you look closer, something deeper is happening. It's not really about communication, it's about permission. The unsettling truth is this: the more you feel the need to explain yourself, the less free you feel to simply exist as you are. The Stoics recognized this long ago. The moment your peace depends on being understood by others, that peace is no longer truly yours. No explanation can guarantee acceptance. No clarity can protect you from judgment. Yet many people spend years trying, carefully shaping their words, adjusting their truth, hoping that if they just explain themselves well enough, they will finally be seen in the right way. But perhaps the real shift is not in finally being understood. Perhaps it lies in no longer needing to be. When that idea begins to settle in, something quietly changes. You stop negotiating your place in the world and begin simply standing in it. Think about the last time you said no to something. Not the word itself, but what followed it, the explanation, the justification, the extra layer you added so the other person would accept it more easily. It almost happens automatically, as if the word no feels incomplete on its own. Most people don't just decline, they explain. Not because they consciously want to, but because something deeper pushes them toward it. And that is where something subtle begins to reveal itself. The need to explain rarely comes from a desire for clarity. More often, it comes from a desire for permission. Somewhere along the way, the simple act of choosing for yourself stopped feeling like enough. It started to feel like something that needed approval, validation, or at least understanding from someone else. When that shift happens, it rarely feels dramatic. It is quiet, almost invisible. Yet it changes the way you move through the world. You stop acting from certainty and begin acting from anticipation. You think ahead, trying to predict reactions before they even happen. You rehearse your words internally, adjusting them so they sound reasonable, acceptable, safe. It's no longer only about what you want or what feels right to you. It becomes about how your choice will be received. Over time, that becomes exhausting, not physically but mentally. Every decision begins to carry an invisible weight, not the decision itself, but the explanation that follows it. At some point, being misunderstood stops feeling like a small inconvenience and begins to feel heavier. Not dangerous in a physical sense, but emotionally uncomfortable in a way that lingers longer than it should. That discomfort starts teaching you something without saying it directly. It quietly teaches you to avoid misunderstanding at all costs, to explain more clearly, more thoroughly, more carefully, so you never have to feel that tension again. Without realizing it, you adapt. You slowly become someone who translates their inner world into something more acceptable, more digestible, more agreeable. But in doing that, something important begins to slip away. Every time you reshape your truth so others can accept it more easily, you move a little further away from yourself. Repeat that process often enough, and eventually you forget what it feels like to trust your own experience without needing validation. You begin relying on other people's responses to decide whether what you feel is reasonable, whether the choices you made are valid. Slowly, your internal authority begins to weaken. Not suddenly, but in small and nearly unnoticeable ways. This is where the deeper tension begins. You are no longer simply living, you are negotiating, not with the world, but with yourself. Every thought is filtered, every emotion is edited, every decision is rehearsed before it is expressed. It becomes exhausting in a way that is difficult to explain because it never truly turns off. Even during quiet moments, your mind continues adjusting, refining, preparing. The Stoics warned about this pattern, not in these exact words, but in principle. They understood that much of human discomfort comes from placing importance on things outside of our control, especially the opinions of others. When you constantly feel the need to explain yourself, that is exactly what you are doing. You are placing your sense of rightness in someone else's understanding. But no matter how clearly you explain yourself, you cannot control how you are perceived. You can speak with precision, act with intention, and still be misunderstood. If your peace depends on avoiding that possibility, it will always feel unstable. You begin reacting instead of acting, adjusting instead of deciding. Over time, your life becomes shaped not by what you believe is right, but by what you think will be accepted. Yet something begins to shift the moment you step outside that pattern. At first it feels uncomfortable, almost unnatural. You say less. You resist the urge to justify. You allow your decisions to stand on their own without explanation. In that space, something unfamiliar appears: silence. Not only around you, but within you. The constant noise of overthinking begins to fade, even if only slightly. That silence can feel unsettling at first, because for the first time you are no longer protecting yourself with explanations. You are simply standing in your choices without defense. That requires something deeper than confidence. It requires internal authority. The Stoics believed a person should be grounded in their own judgment, guided by reason, aligned with their values, not shaped by approval or reaction. That kind of stability does not come from explaining yourself better. It comes from needing to explain yourself less. It comes from trusting that your decisions remain valid even when others do not fully understand them. As that trust grows, your relationships begin to shift, not because you forced anything, but because your presence becomes different. You are no longer trying to convince, to please, or to reshape yourself to meet expectations. Some people will notice immediately. They may question you more, challenge you, or attempt to pull you back into old patterns where you explained everything. But others will respond in a different way. They will sense the clarity, the calmness, the absence of unnecessary justification. There is something quietly powerful about a person who does not feel the need to defend their existence. At that point, a deeper realization begins to settle in. Respect is not gained through endless explanations. It is felt through alignment, through the way you carry yourself. When you stop negotiating your place and stop seeking permission to be who you are, something changes. Eventually you reach a point where the urge to explain begins to dissolve, not because you're trying to prove something, but because there is nothing left to prove. You trust your decisions. You accept your emotions. You allow yourself to exist without constant validation. In that state, something shifts. Not only in how you experience yourself, but also in how the world responds to you. You are no longer asking to be understood. You are no longer adjusting your truth to fit expectations. You are simply present, grounded, and certain in a quiet and steady way. Paradoxically, it is often in that moment, when you stop trying so hard to be understood, that people begin to understand you more clearly. Your words are no longer carrying the weight of justification. They are simply an extension of who you are. If this idea is beginning to settle in, don't rush past it. Let it stay with you. This movement away from constant explanation and toward internal authority is not something you learn once and leave behind. It is something you return to again and again. Subscribing to this channel is not just about watching more videos. It is a small, intentional step, a reminder to keep choosing clarity over approval, alignment over explanation, and truth over acceptance. This pattern often begins early in life, in moments that do not seem significant at first. A feeling that gets dismissed, a reaction that gets corrected, a response that doesn't land the way you expected. You express something honestly, and instead of understanding, you encounter confusion, disagreement, or even subtle rejection. In those moments, something begins to form. A quiet conclusion that your natural expression might not be enough as it is, that maybe it needs to be adjusted, refined, explained in a way that others can accept more easily. So you start adapting, not all at once, but gradually. You learn to translate what you feel into something more acceptable, something less likely to create friction. As Carl Jung once observed, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Yet for many people, that process is interrupted early, shaped instead by the need to be accepted before being authentic. At first, that distance doesn't feel like a problem. In fact, it can even seem helpful. It smooths interactions. It avoids tension. It creates a sense of control over how you are perceived. But over time, that control comes with a cost. The more you rely on explanation to make yourself acceptable, the less you trust your own experience on its own. You begin questioning your initial reactions. You hesitate before expressing something honestly. You feel the need to check, to adjust, to make sure it will be understood the right way. Without realizing it, you begin depending on that process. This is where the deeper pattern begins to take hold. Once you rely on others to confirm your experience, it becomes harder to stand within it by yourself. You start looking outward for signals. You pay attention to reactions, tones, subtle cues that indicate whether what you said was acceptable. Those signals begin guiding you more than your own sense of truth. You adjust not because you want to, but because you feel you must. It seems safer, more stable, less likely to create discomfort. There is a quiet insight that speaks directly to this tendency. We are often more frightened than we are actually hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality. The fear of being misunderstood often feels bigger than the reality of it. That fear creates urgency. It pushes you to explain, to fix, to prevent something that might never even happen. By doing that, the pattern continues. The explanation becomes a way of managing fear, even though it never truly resolves it. As this continues, something else begins to shift. You slowly forget what it feels like to trust your own experience without translating it, without reshaping it into something easier for others to accept. That original clarity becomes less familiar. It is replaced by a more cautious, calculated way of expressing yourself, one that feels safer, but also more distant, more controlled, but less authentic. Eventually, this way of living becomes your default. You don't just explain yourself in certain situations, you explain yourself in almost all of them. It becomes automatic, a reflex instead of a choice. When something becomes that automatic, it's easy to believe it is simply part of who you are, something normal and necessary. But underneath that assumption, there is a quiet question waiting to be noticed. Not loud or urgent, but powerful once you see it clearly. What happens when the way you learned to feel safe is also the thing that keeps you disconnected from yourself? You begin living in a constant state of negotiation, not with the world, but with yourself. From the outside, it doesn't look dramatic. It appears calm, controlled, almost invisible. But internally, it is constant. Every thought is filtered before it is expressed. Every emotion is adjusted before it is shown. Every decision is rehearsed in advance, shaped to feel acceptable, safe, unlikely to create friction. Over time, this becomes your normal. Not because you consciously chose it, but because it feels like the most stable way to move through life. At first, it may even seem like a strength. You become someone who thinks carefully, communicates clearly, and avoids unnecessary conflict. You read situations well. You understand how people might react. You anticipate misunderstandings and try to prevent them before they even happen. In many ways, that appears to be emotional intelligence. But there is a subtle shift hidden inside that process. What begins as awareness slowly turns into dependence. You are no longer simply aware of how others might respond. You begin relying on that awareness to guide your actions. That is where the exhaustion begins. Not because thinking itself is tiring, but because you are no longer thinking only about what feels true for you. You are also thinking about how that truth will be received. You are carrying not only your own perspective, but the imagined perspectives of everyone around you. And that creates a kind of mental weight that never fully disappears. It follows you into conversations, into decisions, even into moments when you are completely alone. Because the negotiation doesn't end when the interaction finishes. It continues internally, replaying what happened, adjusting it, refining it again and again. This is the hidden cost of constantly managing how you are perceived. Life slowly stops being about living freely and starts becoming about presenting yourself in a way that reduces risk. And that risk is rarely clear or defined. It isn't always tied to something specific. Instead, it appears as a vague sense of discomfort that surfaces whenever you imagine being misunderstood, judged, or rejected. So you try to stay ahead of it. You explain more, you clarify more, you make sure your intentions are visible, your reasoning is clear, and your actions are justified. Yet while doing this, something essential slowly fades: your connection to your own internal authority, that quiet sense that your decisions are valid because they align with what you believe, not because others fully understand them. Once your attention shifts toward controlling how you are perceived, your sense of right and wrong becomes less about your own judgment and more about external reactions. Your choices begin to be measured by how easily they are accepted, how well they are received, and how little resistance they create. Stoic thinkers address this idea directly, even if they expressed it differently. They emphasize the importance of recognizing what lies within your control and what does not. Your actions, your intentions, and your values belong to you. But how others interpret them, how they react, and how they judge them exists outside your control. Yet the moment you feel compelled to constantly explain yourself, that boundary becomes blurred. You begin to treat other people's understanding as something you should be able to control. And this creates a subtle instability inside you because you're investing energy into something that will always remain uncertain. There is a powerful clarity in the idea that it is not events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. The discomfort of being misunderstood is rarely just about the misunderstanding itself. It's about what you believe that misunderstanding represents. It can feel like rejection, disapproval, or even a threat to your identity. Because of that, you try to prevent it. You explain, you justify, you adjust, not necessarily because the situation demands it, but because the emotion behind it pushes you in that direction. But this creates a deeper difficulty. No matter how carefully you explain yourself, you cannot fully control how others perceive you. Someone may still misunderstand you. Someone may still judge you. Someone may still disagree. When that happens, all the effort you invested into managing perception suddenly feels fragile, like something that could collapse at any moment, and that fragility creates more tension rather than less. So the cycle continues. You feel the need to explain even more, to clarify further, to make sure nothing is left open to misinterpretation. This is how the pattern sustains itself. You explain in order to avoid discomfort, yet the very act of explaining strengthens the belief that discomfort must be avoided at all costs. Over time, that belief grows stronger than your own sense of truth. Eventually, you start trusting the process of explanation more than your own judgment. It becomes a way to feel secure, even if that sense of security only lasts for a moment. And somewhere within that pattern, a quiet question begins to appear. Not loudly, not urgently, but persistently. What happens if you stop negotiating with yourself? What happens if you allow a decision to exist without explanation? Not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of trust. Trust in your own perspective, your reasoning, and your sense of what feels right for you. Because the truth is simple. The more your choices rely on external understanding to feel valid, the less stable those choices will seem. But the more you learn to stand behind your decisions without needing them to be accepted, the more grounded you become. Not because everyone suddenly agrees with you, but because your certainty no longer depends on their agreement. This shift rarely happens all at once. It begins in small moments, in choosing not to explain something that doesn't require explanation, in allowing a misunderstanding to exist without rushing to correct it, in quietly recognizing that your internal authority does not need to be negotiated every time you interact with the world. This is where anxiety begins to take shape in a way that becomes difficult to ignore. It doesn't arrive suddenly. Instead, it builds gradually, layer by layer, thought by thought. At first, it is only a brief hesitation. Then it becomes overthinking. After that, it turns into the urge to clarify, to adjust, to revisit something you already said just to make sure it was understood properly. Even when nothing actually goes wrong, when no one criticizes you or reacts negatively, the impulse remains. Quiet but persistent, urging you to say just a little more, to fix something that might not even need fixing. As Seneca observed, we often suffer more in imagination than in reality, yet that imagined discomfort alone is enough to keep the cycle of explanation alive. At that point, it's no longer about the situation itself. It becomes about what might happen if you fail to step in and manage it. Once the mind becomes accustomed to anticipating misunderstanding, it begins to treat it as something that must be prevented at all costs. So you start filling the gaps before anyone else can. You explain your tone, your intentions, and your reasoning, sometimes before anyone even questions them. For a moment, it creates the illusion of control, as if you have reduced the chances of being judged or misinterpreted. But that sense of control fades quickly, replaced by the next moment, the next conversation, the next possibility of being misunderstood. This is where overthinking stops being a simple habit and turns into a self-reinforcing pattern. The more you explain, the more compelled you feel to explain again, because each explanation strengthens the belief that without it something might go wrong, that without it you might be seen incorrectly. Gradually, this creates a constant mental loop that rarely shuts off. Even in quiet moments, your mind keeps working through possibilities, replaying past conversations and preparing for future ones. The reality, however, remains simple, even if it feels uncomfortable. No matter how clearly you explain yourself, you cannot fully control how others perceive you. You can choose your words carefully. You can communicate your intentions honestly. You can make your reasoning as clear as possible. Yet someone may still misunderstand you, interpret your actions differently than you intended, or disagree with what you said. If your sense of stability depends on preventing that from happening, it will always feel uncertain. There is a deep clarity in the idea that you have power over your own mind, not over external events. The moment your attention shifts away from your own actions and toward how others interpret them, you slowly give up that power, not suddenly, but gradually. You begin reacting instead of choosing, adjusting instead of deciding, and before you realize it, your behavior is shaped by external reactions rather than your own internal compass. This is where the shift becomes visible. You are no longer acting based on what you believe is right. Instead, you begin acting according to what you think will be accepted. Those two things are not the same, are not the. One is rooted and stable, the other is conditional. One comes from within. The other depends on forces outside of you. The more you rely on acceptance as your guide, the further you drift from your own sense of direction. At first, the changes seem small. You adjust your words slightly. You explain more than necessary. None of it feels extreme. But over time, those small adjustments accumulate. They create a pattern where your actions are shaped by anticipation, by imagined reactions, and the desire to avoid discomfort. Eventually, the pattern becomes automatic. At that point, it is no longer something you do occasionally. It becomes part of how you move through life. You filter yourself without realizing it. You explain things before anyone asks. You soften your boundaries before they are even challenged. Because it happens so naturally, it begins to feel normal, as if this is simply how life works. Yet beneath that sense of normality, there is a quiet tension that never fully disappears. No matter how much effort you put into managing perception, you can never fully succeed. There will always be uncertainty, always the possibility that someone sees things differently. That means the effort never truly ends. The explaining never completely stops. The adjustment never feels finished. As Marcus Aurelius reminds us, you have power over your mind, not over external events. The more you attempt to control how others see you, the further you move away from that power. And that realization slowly leads to a different question. Not how you can explain yourself better, but whether this is even a game that can be won at all. Because no matter how much effort you put into controlling perception, something will always remain outside your control. And if that is true, the question naturally shifts. What would it look like to stop trying to control what cannot be controlled? To act according to your own judgment without first securing someone else's understanding? To allow your actions to stand on their own without constantly reinforcing them with explanation? Because the moment you stop playing that game, something changes. Not immediately in how others see you, but in how you experience yourself. The tension begins to loosen. The constant need to adjust starts to fade. In its place, something more stable begins to form. Not perfect certainty, but a quieter kind of confidence, one that doesn't depend on being understood to exist. That feeling doesn't appear out of nowhere. It comes from repetition, from years of reinforcing the idea that your choices need context to be valid, that your feelings need justification to be accepted. So when you step away from that pattern even slightly, your mind reacts. It tells you something is missing, that you should say more, that you should clarify, not because the situation demands it, but because you've grown accustomed to filling that space. But if you stay in the moment, if you resist the urge to explain, something else begins to emerge. Silence. Not just the absence of words, but the absence of that internal pressure to constantly adjust and justify. At first, the silence feels unfamiliar. It doesn't feel peaceful immediately. It feels exposed. Without explanation, there is nothing softening your position, nothing cushioning your choices. What you decide simply exists without defense, and that is where the real shift begins. Standing in your decisions without explaining them requires something deeper than confidence. It requires internal authority, the kind that doesn't come from being understood, but from being aligned with yourself. For most people, that authority hasn't been fully developed, not because of incapacity, but because so much energy has been spent looking outward for validation that the internal foundation is weakened. The Stoics spoke about this grounding in ways that feel immediate when experienced. They believed a person should be rooted in their own judgment, guided by reason, aligned with their values, not swayed by approval, not dependent on agreement, not shaped by external reactions. When you begin to stop explaining yourself unnecessarily, you move in that direction, slowly but noticeably. There is quiet clarity in the principle that you should waste no time arguing what a good person should be. It points to something simple yet overlooked. Your actions don't need constant explanation to be valid. Who you are is not defined by how well you justify yourself, but by consistently acting in alignment with what you believe is right. The more you rely on explanation to define yourself, the further you move from that simplicity. As you allow your decisions to stand without explanation, something begins to settle internally, gradually. The constant noise of overthinking starts to fade. The urge to replay conversations, refine what you said, add what you didn't, becomes less intense, because you no longer try to perfect how you're perceived. You simply act and let that be enough. This doesn't mean you stop communicating or become indifferent. Your communication becomes more intentional. You speak when it matters, not when it feels necessary to justify your existence. You explain when clarity is needed, not when you feel pressure to be accepted. That distinction changes everything. Your words now come from choice, not fear. With that shift, a different stability begins to form, one that isn't dependent on others' responses, doesn't require constant reinforcement. It's quieter but stronger, less visible but more consistent. It doesn't demand attention, but it holds its ground. The more you rely on that internal stability, the less you feel the need to seek it externally. Discomfort doesn't vanish immediately. The urge to explain returns sometimes, silence feels exposed, saying less feels risky. But those moments become opportunities to notice the impulse, understand it, and choose differently when it feels right. This isn't about rigidity, it's about the ability to stand in your choices without constant support. To trust that your decisions are valid because they align with your judgment, not because others understand them. That trust comes from needing to say less, not more. Over time, it becomes natural. You don't remind yourself to explain less. It simply happens, not because you hold back, but because there is less to prove, less to justify, less to defend. In that space, it becomes clear that the stability you sought through explanation was always within you. You only needed to stop looking for it where it could never fully exist. As you reach that point, something shifts in a way that is hard to ignore, not just internally, but externally. Your relationships begin to change, not through deliberate effort or new rules, but because your presence is different. You no longer approach interactions with the subtle need to be understood at all costs. You no longer shape your words to secure approval before speaking. That shift, even quietly, is noticeable. You say a little less, explain a little less, pause before extra justification, and sometimes don't add it at all. In those moments, the dynamic changes. People used to a version of you that explains, softens, and adjusts feel the difference. Not always consciously, but they sense it. There is less to grab, less to question, less to reshape. Some respond immediately, subtly pushing back, asking more questions, trying to pull you back into old patterns. That can feel uncomfortable, not because you're wrong, but because the old dynamic is no longer reinforced. As Epictetus taught, if you seek to please others, you risk losing yourself. That discomfort signals realignment. It isn't random, it comes from a shift in balance. When you constantly explained yourself, you were offering control, giving others the ability to evaluate, interpret, approve, or disapprove with full context. Without that stream of explanation, control is reduced. There's less to analyze, less space to influence, which can feel unsettling. But not everyone reacts that way. Some see the same shift as clarity, calmness, quiet confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. Without explaining anything, you begin to be perceived differently, not because you're projecting, but because your presence is undiluted by unnecessary justification. There is inherent power in someone who does not feel the need to defend their existence. It doesn't demand attention, but it creates a sense of stability others can feel. When someone stops constantly adjusting to expectations, consistency emerges in how they show up. That consistency builds a different kind of respect, not from being agreeable, but from being aligned. A deeper realization arises: respect is not earned through better explanation. It comes from how you relate to yourself, from standing in your decisions without needing external validation. No man is free who is not master of himself. When your actions are constantly shaped by the need to be understood, you are not fully directing them. You are responding, adjusting, negotiating. But when you act from your own judgment without needing approval, something changes. You no longer move in response to others. You move in alignment with yourself. Certain relationships may shift unexpectedly. Some connections that once felt easy might feel strained, not because of wrongdoing, but because they relied on a dynamic that no longer exists. A dynamic where you explained, adjusted, and made yourself easier to accept. Without that pattern, the foundation of those interactions changes. This is not necessarily a loss, even if it feels that way. It's a realignment toward relationships based on mutual respect rather than imbalance. When you no longer feel the need to justify yourself constantly, you also stop accepting situations where that justification is required for acceptance. Over time, this becomes natural. You don't think about it, it simply becomes how you interact. Not because you hold back, but because there is less to prove, manage, or defend. In that space, it becomes clear that others' responses often reflect how you relate to yourself. When your choices require constant validation, others follow that pattern. When your choices stand on their own, without explanation, the pattern shifts and the dynamics of your relationships change. Eventually, something quiet and profound settles. There is no dramatic moment. One day you notice the urge to explain isn't as strong. The impulse is still there, but it no longer controls you. You pause, feel it, and let it pass. In that space, it becomes clear. There is nothing left to prove. This isn't because the world has suddenly become more understanding or more accepting. People are still the same. Reactions still vary. Misunderstandings still happen, but your relationship to them has shifted. You no longer see them as threats that must be managed or corrected at all costs. You begin to see them as part of the natural flow of human interaction, not as a danger to your sense of self. Because of that, the need to constantly adjust, clarify, or justify begins to dissolve naturally. You trust your decisions more, not because you are always certain, but because certainty is no longer required to act. You understand that doubt can exist without invalidating your choices. You allow yourself to feel what you feel without needing to explain it in a way that makes it acceptable to others. That acceptance creates a kind of internal stability that doesn't depend on external confirmation. It's quiet, steady, and in that steadiness, something else begins to change. The way you experience yourself becomes simpler. There's less internal noise, less second-guessing, less replaying of conversations or imagining alternative explanations. You act speak, and move forward, not because you don't care, but because you no longer feel the need to control every outcome. That shift creates a presence that wasn't there before. At the same time, the way the world responds to you begins to shift gradually. People perceive you differently. There's clarity in your communication, even when you say less. There's consistency in your actions, even when others don't fully understand your reasoning. That consistency builds a kind of trust, not from explanation, but from alignment. You're no longer asking to be understood. That question no longer carries the same weight. You express yourself when it feels right, without depending on the response to validate your words. You no longer negotiate your place in conversations, relationships, or situations. You occupy that space without needing to justify it. That presence changes the dynamic in ways that are hard to explain, but easy to feel. There's a quiet strength in that state, not because you become immune to misunderstanding, but because the need to constantly correct it is removed. You allow people to interpret you as they will, without intervening every time. By doing so, you create space for the unexpected, for others to meet you without the layers of explanation that once surrounded your words. That clarity subtly changes how you are seen. When you're no longer trying to convince, your words carry a different weight. They are shaped not by the need to be accepted, but by the intention to be true. That difference is felt even if not consciously recognized. People respond not just to what you say, but how you say it, to the absence of hesitation, over-explanation, or subtle need for approval. Paradoxically, when you stop trying to be understood, understanding becomes more likely, not because you explain better, but because there's less interference, less noise, less adjustment. Your communication becomes clearer precisely because it is simpler, free from the weight of justification. This doesn't mean every interaction becomes easy or every relationship perfectly balanced. Moments of tension, disagreement, and misunderstanding still occur, but they no longer define your experience. They no longer pull you into the cycle of explanation and adjustment. You notice, acknowledge, and move forward. In that movement, it becomes clear that your sense of self was never meant to be negotiated. Your choices were never meant to be constantly justified, and your presence does not need explanation to be valid. These are not concepts to prove. They are realities that become obvious when you stop defending them. Over time, this way of being becomes natural. You don't treat it as a strategy or technique. It simply becomes how you move through the world, grounded, present, quietly steady. Not because everything is always clear, but because you trust yourself enough to act without constant confirmation. That trust changes everything, not only how you see yourself, but how you experience life. When you stop explaining yourself at every turn, you free a part of your mind that was always occupied. In that space, something else grows: clarity, focus, a deeper connection to your own thoughts and values. In the end, the shift is simple, but not easy. You stop explaining yourself, not to prove something, but because there's nothing left to prove. In that quiet realization, you experience a freedom that was always available, just hidden beneath the constant need to be understood. At some point, you realize it was never about explaining yourself better. It was about finally trusting yourself enough to stop. When that happens, everything changes, not because the world becomes clearer, but because you do.